My name is Akshat, and I am a senior surveyor with the Standard Club. The global maritime sector is under increasing pressure to reduce the environmental impact of its operations. In response to the UN climate action initiatives and in line with the Paris Agreement temperature goals, the IMO has outlined its strategy and targets for reducing the carbon intensity of international shipping. Now, these targets are to be accomplished by a blend of measures applicable in the short term, medium, and long term basis. And the first wave of regulations will take effect from 1st of January 2023. These include Energy Efficiency Index for existing ships, or commonly known as EEXI regulations, which addresses the technical efficiency of ships. Then we have Carbon Intensity Indicator, or CII regulations addressing the operational efficiency, and Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, or SIMP, addressing the management system. Complying with the IMO targets and related regulation is already creating considerable disruption to the maritime sector, and the impact on the industry is expected to be increasingly felt during the coming decade. Keeping this in mind, the Standard Club has formed an internal alternative fuels working group. The aim of this working group is to assist our members in making informed decisions towards a safe, sustainable, and successful transition to greener energy solutions. We have also established an advisory panel that consists of key professionals within the maritime industry. So today, I'm joined by Douglas Wright, who is a regional advisory services manager at Lloyd's Register. Douglas has a strong background spanning over 20 years in marine fuels and ships propulsion machinery. In his current position, Douglas is responsible for decarbonization advisory to shipping companies in Asia region. Currently, he is very busy with the initial stages of decarbonization in shipping through offering CII, SIMP, and other marine advisory services to clients in Asia. Today, Douglas will be responding to some of the pertinent questions related to the upcoming CII and SIMP Part 3 regulations and the related challenges for the maritime sector. So, Douglas, welcome. Why have the CII requirements have been introduced to the shipping?
Thank you so much, Akshat, and thank you for Standard Club being here to answer some of these questions. You mentioned in your introduction already that EEXI, which was a measure to bring all the new ships in line to be as technically efficient as they can be, and coming into play in 2023. And that's very much a technical measure. So we've achieved technical efficient ships, but we can't really stop there. We know that the IMO stated ambition is to reduce carbon intensity by 40% in 2030 and 70% by 2050. So technical measures for EEXI will not bring us to those stated goals. So the CII requirements are very much a means to operationally reduce carbon intensity year on year against a falling reduction target year on year. So currently we're looking at a combined 11% reduction of carbon emissions against the 2019 baseline. And this well may accelerate 2027 onwards once in 2026 the IMO will have reviewed the short-term GHG measures in 2026 and whether or not any more stringent reductions are required to meet the stated goals. So that's very much where CII plays in. EEXI, technical efficiency, CII, very much efficiently operated ships. So that's really the reason for the driver by IMO to come up with this policy tool, Akshat.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Douglas. And how does the SIM Part 3 plays into this?
That's a very interesting question, and maybe a little bit of a history lesson around SEMP or Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan might be prudent here. We know that in 2013, all ships had to have a ship energy efficiency management plan in play, which just generally dealt with energy efficiency as it pertained to running the ship. So that was one. Then that got followed in 2019 by the IMO DCS inclusion in SEM Part 2, where ships had to articulate how the fuel consumption is measured through bunker delivery notes, mass flow meters, whatever means they wanted to use to basically demonstrate this is how much fuel we're using and this is how much CO2 we are generating. So on that basis, SEM Part 3 is slightly different because SEM Part 1 and SEM Part 2, you concluded them, you put it on board ship, and it's very much a paper-based exercise. Once it's done, you hardly review it unless perhaps you change your means of measuring bunker fuel consumption. But SEM Part 3 is very much a dynamic plan because owner operators will have to calculate their CII as it stands now today and articulate over the next 3 years how they are going to maintain the CII that they've calculated based on last year's IMO DCS data or any other DCS data that best reflects their fuel consumption and trading pattern. So let's say a ship is operating at a C, an annual efficiency rating of C now. In 2 years' time, that might well have deteriorated to a rating of D if we look forwards and we follow the reduced trend of carbon intensity. So the owner operator will then have to put in its plan, okay, next year we will do more frequent hull cleaning, or we'll do trim optimization, or we will install an energy savings device such as an air lubrication system or a Mewis duct or any of those kind of technologies that are available. So it's very much a strategic plan that allows you to know where you are now and how you're going to maintain pace with the reduction factors year on year, remembering that I started this answer by that by 2026, we need to have achieved an 11% overall reduction against the 2019 baseline, and that will most likely accelerate 2027 onwards as IMO is trying to articulate what needs to be done to get to the 40% carbon intensity reduction that is required by 2030.
That's very interesting, Douglas, and thanks for sharing that information. So, in terms of your client base, what are the challenges that you're seeing in terms of the calculations of CII or preparation of SIMP?
Again, that's quite an interesting question, and it's actually quite important to note, of course, that the last 2 years we have been plagued by the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant a lot of ships did not necessarily do long voyages or were fully utilized. So ships that idle a lot generally tend to get a poorer CII rating because the calculation of CII is a function of fuel consumption times the CO2 conversion factor divided by the deadweight ton times nautical miles traveled. So the shorter the voyage or the less utilization a ship has, it actually impacts the CII requirements negatively. And in this respect, IMO did not in the recent MEPC 78 put any correction factors in play for that. Similarly to ships operating in inclement or adverse weather, where the safety of the ship might be compromised, of course, the ship would have to use more fuel. And that also has a negative impact on the CII. So, in a way, that is a interesting kind of dynamic that's yet to play out in future MEPC meetings of what can we do to kind of get those correction factors implemented. Similarly, we look at ship types such as cruise ships. They generally tend to have longer port stays. So yeah, their CII tend to be slightly uh, less positively impacted by that very nature of their trade. But again, hopefully within the next MEPC meetings, there will be a mechanism to address that as well. Similarly to like boil off gas from gas carriers, a correction factor is most likely to be needed there as well. Otherwise, that will also have a negative impact on the global LNG carrier fleet. So it's a myriad of challenges, Akshat, and they can't necessarily be pinpointed on necessarily one ship type. But overall, nautical miles traveled in a year seems to be the issue because of COVID-19 impacted the world trade, of course, somewhat in shipping, and to an extent things like adverse weather. How do we deal with it, and is it fair to have ships perhaps have a negatively impacted CII because of those circumstances? So hopefully within the next MEPC 70 MEPC meetings we will see a resolution to these kind of challenges, Akshat.
Indeed, a lot of work and deliberations to be taken in the next IMO's MEPC meeting. Thanks for highlighting that, Douglas. Now, you have covered the short-term requirements, but then how do we see this to be playing out on a long-term basis?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Akshat. So we've already discussed during this vodcast EEXI, CII, SEMP, and how that is kind of the short to mid-term measure. Of course, we'll also have market-based measures such as EU ETS and carbon levies such as potentially IMO, even fuel EU maritime regulations coming into play. So that's will start slowly drive the energy transition. But in the short term, I would suggest that technical measures and operational measures will most likely support for the next couple of years ships being able to maintain their CII or annual efficiency ratio ratings. But of course, that will eventually run its play really, because how much can you operationally optimize? How much energy savings technology devices or measures can you afford to put on all the tonnage, for example? So we probably see toward the end of this decade ships being retired, new tonnage coming in, and those ships definitely should have a consideration for lower to zero carbon fuels. And we will not necessarily immediately get there as a silver bullet solution, but lower to zero carbon fuels. We know that fuels can be generated from very many different pathways. One of them is gray from LNG, for example, in the case of ammonia, methanol, hydrogen. Uh, this could eventually turn into maybe sources of green production of such fuels. So we'll have a life cycle emission that gets positively impacted, and eventually the advent of renewable fuels, which can hopefully over time transition to be quite competitively produced and therefore priced. But I think as an overall conclusion, that is kind of the journey that we see play out over the next 20 to 30 years. But of course, to accelerate some of that development, the inclusion of market-based measures to bring some of the cost of these new fuels on parity with the old fuels, for lack of a better definition, referring to hydrocarbon bunker fuels as we know it now, will definitely be thrown into the mix to start accelerating the adoption of those new fuels. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we start with CII and eventually operationally, technically measures morph and move into the energy transition. But one thing is for sure, shipping will have to transition and start taking up these new lower to zero carbon fuels. It's a very challenging question. The industry is really, scratching their head on many of the issues, supply and demand of those new fuels. What will the ship design look like? What will the propulsion machinery look like? What about the risks? There's a lot to go through for the industry, but my perspective is the industry has always demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity, and I have no doubt that shipping will do its best to reduce its carbon intensity in line with the Paris Accord. Thank you so much, Akshat.
Indeed, indeed, I agree with you, Douglas. This is really interesting. And then we have the classification societies like Lloyd Register and insurers like us collaborating on fronts like this: alternative fuels, decarbonization, with a common agenda of assisting the client base. Thanks a lot, Douglas, for taking time today and addressing these pertinent questions. Thanks for sharing your valuable insights. For those who are watching this video, I hope you had a good takeaway from this session and wish you all a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.